Welcome to week 9 of the course. I want to take a few minutes and wrap up the last week, introduce the next week, answer a few questions, and then briefly talk about the final essay exam. So week 8, we've looked at the Assyrian period, or the Neo-Assyrian period, which began around, let's say, 1000 BC, and extended until the fall of Nineveh, approximately 612 BC. This was a very significant time period in the history of the ancient Near East. We find the first real true empire in the Assyrians. And the Assyrians have this reputation for being a very, very violent empire, using various means of propaganda, torture, military and economic and political, what we call hard power, to carry out their will, to extend the empire, to bring various other powers underneath their control, and ultimately to reap the financial benefits of that. As the empire grew, it became more and more dependent upon the tribute and the plunder that they would take or receive from the smaller states that they would conquer, Israel and Judah being among these. And you can see just how much plunder, just how much tribute they would receive by reading the account of Sennacherib campaigning against Hezekiah in Judah, and how much gold and other things that Hezekiah gave to the Assyrians. But in many ways, their reputation is well deserved. They certainly did physically torture individuals. We look at wall reliefs from Assyrian palaces that depict people being flayed and beheaded and tortured in various other means, dismembered and things like that. We have textual records of this. We have letters. In fact, in one letter during the Neo-Assyrian period, I think from the reign of Sargon or somewhere around that time, basically the king threatens that anybody who does not show up at the appointed time, they're going to be impaled in their own house in front of their own children. We find a number of threats of cannibalism and impalement and things like burning victims in Assyrian treaties. And for the most part, I think scholars, at least I believe, and many scholars would as well, that they intended to carry these things out in the case that a king or other foreign officials rebelled or didn't fulfill their obligations of the treaty. Anyway, so this period was very significant, and we saw, ultimately the fall of Assyria around fall of Israel around 720, and really the rise of the Judean state as the primary Israelite nation in Canaan. You read a number of articles, one of which discussed the Bible and monuments, and you should have taken away from that at least that there are few, if any, royal monuments from ancient Israel and Judah. We find a number of letters and other texts, and of course we have the ultimate product being the Old Testament, which is a curated library of texts originating from at least after 1000 BC, and many of these texts having their origin during the Neo-Assyrian period. Now, the fact that there are no royal monuments from ancient Israel or Judah is a really curious phenomenon, in that we even find royal monuments from Moab, which is even a much smaller state even than Israel or Judah. We find Phoenician monuments, we find monuments from Ugarit, and of course a plethora of monuments from Assyria, Babylonia, and Egypt, even from the Hittite Empire. Now, W. Hallow proposes that the answer lies in ancient Israel's theocratic ideology, in the sense that many of the other ancient Near Eastern monuments were meant to commemorate the deeds of a particular king, but because Yahweh was king in ancient Israel, there was a reticence to commemorate the deeds of the living earthly king. We also read texts from the Black Obelisk, which is from the reign of Shalmaneser III, in which he talks about Jehu paying tribute and submitting to him, and there's even a depiction, albeit very idiosyncratic and stylistic, of Jehu bowing down to Shalmaneser. And then, of course, you did read a Judean monument in the Siloam tunnel inscription, which is not a royal monument. It was actually meant to commemorate the completion of a tunnel made in Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah, likely in preparation for Sennacherib's campaign against Judah. And so it the project itself was a part of the kind of the royal preparation to rebel against Sennacherib, but the monument itself was completed by the workers, and it was not does not appear to have been initiated as a royal deed. The Assyrian period, again, we find significant Assyrian hegemony in the ancient Near East. We find the fall of Israel in 720, and of course this was not the only campaign into the Levant by the Assyrians. We find a number of campaigns, and many of them against Israel and Judah. In 701, Sennacherib campaigns against Judah because Hezekiah rebels, and ultimately Jerusalem survived, which contributed to this idea of Zion being an impenetrable fortress protected by Yahweh. During this period, a number of biblical prophets were active. In the 8th century, Micah, Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, and then later on, ultimately toward the end of the Assyrian period, we find prophets such as Jeremiah, who is significantly active, particularly during Josiah's reform period. And we find a number of texts that allow us to compare A&E texts with biblical texts. Prophetic texts, there are a number of prophetic texts from the Neo-Assyrian period during the reigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. We find a number of treaty and loyalty oaths also from the reign of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. And then we find a lot of Assyrian influence even in the biblical text in terms of propaganda. The image that we get of Assyria in the biblical text is certainly in many ways influenced by the actual practices of the Assyrians, but also in many ways influenced by the propaganda that Assyria itself put out. And we find a lot of parallels there. And also in iconography, so not only textual but also ancient art imagery. We find astral imagery influencing Israelite iconography, and also perhaps the Assyrian imagery of naked goddesses influencing what is now called Judean pillar figurines. We find a number of these small clay or terracotta figurines that may represent some type of female goddess or a goddess all around ancient Israel, many of them found in Judah or Judea. So that's the Neo-Assyrian period. I hope it was very fruitful reading about that portion of history and getting an understanding of what was happening around the larger ancient Near East during that period of ancient Israel's history. Now, moving into week 9, we're going to introduce the Neo-Babylonian period, which is a rather short period, actually. So, although the Babylonians were, in many ways, a significant power throughout the history of the ancient Near East, really Assyria was the dominant power in the early first millennium. It was only until the late 7th century that the Assyrians, or the Babylonians and the Medes, rebelled against and fought against the Assyrians and ultimately defeated the Assyrians, sacking Nineveh around 612, and then ultimately defeating the remnants of the Assyrian Empire in the next several years. So the Babylonians became the dominant force, and of course, one individual, one king that you would immediately recognize as a Neo-Babylonian king is Nebuchadnezzar, who of course is responsible for the fall of Jerusalem around 586 BC. Now, again, Israel during the Neo-Babylonian period has already been defeated, and only Judah is left as kind of an Israelite state. And of course, this is a period of the exile. Now, again, the Neo-Babylonian period only lasts for about 100 years or so. But we find a lot of literary influence, most likely coming from the time of the exile, where Judeans would have been intimately familiar with Babylonian religion and literature and things like that as they were exiles in Babylonia. We find a further prophetic activity, particularly in the characters of Jeremiah, who was active during the exile, and Ezekiel. Um, Now what we don't find is much iconographic or royal textual evidence from this period from the Neo-Babylonians. They just simply didn't have the same type of palace architecture or decoration that the Assyrians did, so we don't find many royal reliefs. We also don't find many royal annals. We find chronicles, which are kind of year by year, very concise statements of something that happened during that period, which we'll read some during this week. But we don't find the same type of royal annals that we do from the Neo-Assyrians, which provide lengthy descriptions of Assyrian campaigns and political relationships. So hopefully this week, again, gives you some insight into the historical context of ancient Israel and Judah and the larger ancient Near East during this time period between the fall of the Assyrians in 612 and up to the fall of Jerusalem in 586, and then later until the fall of the Babylonians to the Persians and the Medes later in the 6th century. Now, a number of questions were raised. Some of these I'm still chewing on, still kind of developing some responses for. But I'd like to address some of these by some of the students. One of them was, do any gods represent Yahweh? I think it's a very important question because, of course, we find a lot of movements toward kind of a monotheism or a monotheistic perspective in the ancient Near East, one of these being Akhenaten's attempt to reform Egyptian religion during the Amarna period and focus exclusively on the worship of Aten. We also find something not exactly the same but similar going on in Babylonia with the rise of Marduk and the attempt to personify Marduk as a number of other deities. Now, I'm certainly not a universalist, so I think, just to answer this question in brief, I don't think that every deity that was worshipped in the ancient Near East was in some way a personification or a misidentification of Yahweh. But we do find in texts such as Amos 9:7, things such as this. Amos goes, "Are you not as the sons of Ethiopia to me, O sons of Israel, declares Yahweh? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" So even in the biblical text, we do find some resonance with the idea that Yahweh was active in the lives of and the histories of other nations beyond just Israel and Judah. So is it possible that some ancient Near Eastern cultures experienced Yahweh working in their history and misidentified that deity, claiming that he was somebody else? Possible. We don't know for sure. I think this certainly is a more kind of theological question than an ancient history question. Another question that was raised was, how do we preach the Old Testament honestly while pointing to Jesus as well? Meaning, how do we give the Old Testament its own conceptual autonomy? How do we let the text speak for itself, not superimpose maybe a inappropriate Christological reading onto the text, while also still believing that the text does in some way point to Jesus? And here I would raise two concepts. One is denotation and connotation, or you could even say meaning and significance. Now, the denotation of a text is what a text means. The connotation of a text is the idea or feeling that a word or a text invokes in addition to its primary literal meaning. And here's an example. Isaiah 7 is a very significant passage in Christian theology. It's the Emmanuel passage, the passage where Isaiah approaches Ahaz and tells him not to worry in light of the pressure that he's receiving from the Syrians and the Israelites in attempting to coerce Ahaz into joining the anti-Assyrian coalition. So Isaiah brings Ahaz a word of promise, a word of assurity that if he trusts in Yahweh and does not trust in human powers, then Yahweh will protect him. Now, the word from Isaiah is meant to have a close temporal fulfillment. When Isaiah says that a young woman is pregnant or has conceived, this is a present tense, really a past perfect verb. It's not that a young woman will conceive. It's that a young woman has conceived. The passage and the message in and of itself is not about Jesus. Isaiah is talking to Ahaz and talking about the salvation or deliverance of Judah in a very short time frame. Now, if we read into Isaiah chapter 8, we see a lot of resonance with Isaiah going in and impregnating a female prophetess, and we also find the other symbolic names. We also find the word Emmanuel. And so some scholars have sought to identify the fulfillment of Isaiah 7 in Isaiah 8 in Isaiah's own activity. Another idea is that the prophecy is about Hezekiah. So Ahaz has basically been fired, and the salvation and deliverance of Judah will happen during Hezekiah's time. And we find this as well, right? So Jerusalem is delivered from the Assyrians during Hezekiah's reign. So I think the text in and of itself, its denotation, is about the immediate temporal deliverance of Judah from the foreign powers that are pressuring them. But the church has identified a deeper significance in the passage's connotation as it helped them to understand who Jesus was and is. So is the passage about Jesus? Certainly not. Might there be a larger prophetic significance beyond anything that Isaiah could have ever imagined? Absolutely. But in order to even understand why the church would move toward and identify this passage as something that could speak to who Jesus is, we have to understand the passage in its own historical, textual, literary context. So we have to understand the passage's denotation before we can even ever draw out a connotation that's something beyond its original literal meaning. So I hope that helps. I will also. There's a couple other questions that I'll raise. One of them I'll answer next week, which is ideas for presenting A&E texts and OT studies in a ministry context, and then what the implications that could be in terms of what if that raises doubts in people's minds about the historicity of the Bible, etc. So I'll work on that answer. Now, the last thing I want to address is the final exam. So the final exam is going to be constructed as such. It'll be an open book essay-style exam. You'll answer 3 questions. I'll give you 1 to 2 prompts that you have to answer, and then you'll have a choice between a few. You can only use the notes or the resources that are assigned for the class, so the textbooks and any of the articles and online material. And you'll have from Monday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Monday of finals week, until Friday of that week at 11:59 p.m. I think those dates are 4 June to 8 June. Now, I'll post during the course of this week, week 9, tentative essay questions. So I'll give you a list of questions, some of which I will choose from for the exam. Now, as far as length is concerned, again, that will be explained in the exam. I'm not going to identify a particular minimum or maximum for the exam. That'll be up to you. A well-worded, articulated 500-word answer to one of the essay prompts is going to be just as good or better than a verbose, very vague, 5,000-word exam answer. I don't want you to, spend more than the allotted hours for it, which are in the syllabus. But I think that with preparation and with deliberate effort, you'll be able to get the exam done in a reasonable amount of time and not spend too much time on it. I hope that is enough information. Again, I'll provide more information during the course of this week, but that at least gives you the general structure of the exam. I hope you have a great day and a great week, and I look forward to engaging with you as we explore the Neo-Babylonian period.